The snowstorm outside was relentless, its icy winds shaking the wooden walls of Jack's cabin. Inside, Jack, a retired firefighter, sat alone in his living room, cradling a steaming mug of coffee. The glow from the fireplace flickered across the room, casting dancing shadows on the walls. It had been days since the storm had cut him off from the world, leaving his cabin surrounded by deep snow. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the occasional howl of the wind. Jack leaned back in his chair, staring into the flames, trying to enjoy the silence. But then, something broke it. A faint scratching noise came from the front door. Jack frowned, his brow creasing. He tilted his head, listening carefully. The sound came again, this time clearer, followed by a soft, muffled whimper. His heart began to race. Slowly, he put his mug down on the coffee table and stood up, the sound of his boots heavy on the wooden floor. Walking cautiously toward the door, Jack felt a strange unease settle over him. His hand hesitated over the doorknob, his pulse quickening. He peered through the frosted glass window, his breath fogging the cold surface. What he saw made him freeze. Outside, barely visible against the storm, stood a German shepherd. Her fur was frosted with ice and her body trembled from the cold. But she wasn't alone. Pressed tightly against her were two tiny puppies, barely able to stand. The mother stood protectively, shielding them from the storm, her eyes locked on Jack's with a mixture of desperation and hope. Jack stood there for a long moment, his mind racing. Opening the door could mean trouble, but leaving them out there in the storm? That wasn't an option. Taking a deep breath, Jack turned the knob, and the door creaked open. The freezing wind roared into the cabin, stinging Jack's face and making him squint. The German shepherd didn't move at first, her body stiff with fear. Her pups whimpered softly beneath her, their tiny breaths visible in the frosty air. "Come on, girl," Jack said, crouching down and softening his tone. "You can't stay out there. You'll freeze to death." The dog hesitated, her amber eyes darting between Jack and her puppies. Slowly, she took a step forward, her paws sinking into the thick snow. Then, as if making a decision, she turned back, gently picking up one of the pups by the scruff of its neck. The other pup stumbled after her, its tiny legs barely able to keep up. Jack stepped aside, holding the door open wide as they entered. The warmth of the cabin hit them immediately, and the mother dog trembled harder, her body adjusting to the sudden change in temperature. Jack grabbed an old blanket from the couch and draped it over her and the puppies. At first, she flinched, letting out a soft growl, but when she realized he meant no harm, she sighed deeply and lay down near the fire. Curling her body protectively around her pups, she finally let her guard down just a little. The puppies, barely bigger than Jack's hands, wriggled weakly against their mother's side. Their tiny chests rose and fell with shallow breaths. Jack knelt nearby, watching them closely. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" he murmured, his voice low. The dog's eyes flicked to his, weary but no longer hostile. Jack stood and went to the kitchen, grabbing a bowl and filling it with warm water. He placed it near her and stepped back to give her space. She sniffed at it cautiously before lapping it up, her pups still huddled close to her. Jack couldn't help but wonder where she had come from. What had happened to her? How had she managed to survive out in the storm with two newborn puppies? "You're tougher than you look," Jack said softly, sitting down in his chair and watching them. "Guess that makes two of us." When Jack woke the next morning, the storm had passed, leaving a thick blanket of snow covering the world outside. The cabin was quiet except for the crackling fire, which had burned low during the night. Jack rubbed his eyes and sat up, his first thought going to his unexpected guess. The German shepherd was still lying near the fire, her body curled protectively around her pups. The little ones wriggled and let out soft cries, their tiny tails wagging as they nuzzled against their mother. Jack stood and stretched, the cool morning air biting at his skin. "Morning, girl," he said softly, walking to the kitchen. "Let's see if we can find something for you to eat." He rummaged through his pantry, eventually pulling out a can of chicken soup. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Warming it up on the stove, he poured some into a bowl and placed it near her. She lifted her head, sniffing the air cautiously before leaning forward to eat. The puppies, sensing their mother's movement, let out tiny cries and tried to follow her warmth. Jack smiled as he watched them. "You're a tough one," he said softly, crouching down a few feet away. Carrying those little ones through that storm? That's no small thing. The mother dog glanced at him, her amber eyes softening just a little. Jack could see the exhaustion etched into every inch of her body, but there was also a quiet strength there, a determination to survive and protect her pups, no matter what. As the days went on, Jack began to see the German Shepherd's strength return. Her coat, once matted and thin, started to shine as she ate regularly. Her ribs were still visible, but she no longer looked like a ghost of herself. Jack had named her Grace. The pups, now more energetic, tumbled clumsily around the cabin, their tiny barks filling the once silent space. Jack had named them Snow and Ash, their playful antics bringing a smile to his face every day. At first, Grace was cautious, always keeping a watchful eye on Jack whenever he came near her pups. But over time, she began to trust him. She would wag her tail slightly when he approached, and one day she even allowed him to gently pet her head. "You've got some tough little ones there, Grace," Jack said one evening, sitting on the floor near the fire. "They take after their mom." Grace lifted her head, her eyes meeting his. There was something in her gaze, gratitude maybe, or a quiet understanding. Jack felt a lump rise in his throat as he reached out to scratch behind her ears. "I don't know where you came from," he murmured, "but you're safe now. I promise." A week passed, and the snow outside began to thaw under the pale winter sun. The days were quieter now, filled with the soft sounds of paws on the wooden floor, the crackling of the fire, and Jack's occasional laughter as Snow and Ash stumbled over each other in clumsy play. Grace had started to relax. She no longer flinched at every sound, and her growls had softened into gentle sighs whenever Jack sat nearby. She even wagged her tail a little more often, especially when Jack returned from chopping wood or checking his traps outside. But as peaceful as things seemed, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. One afternoon, as Jack worked on splitting firewood in the yard, he noticed Grace standing by the window. Her nose was pressed against the glass, her ears perked up and alert. Snow and Ash tumbled playfully at her feet, oblivious to their mother's tension. Jack paused, wiping the sweat from his brow. "What is it, girl?" he muttered under his breath. Grace's tail was stiff, her body frozen as if she sensed something Jack couldn't see. She let out a low growl, her eyes locked on the edge of the woods. Jack followed her gaze, squinting at the tree line, but he saw nothing. The forest stood silent, the snow blanketing the ground undisturbed. Still, Jack felt a prickle of unease. Grace's instincts were sharp, sharper than his own. If she thought something was wrong, she was probably right. "Come on," Jack said, walking toward the cabin. "Let's get back inside." Grace didn't move until Jack opened the door. Only then did she step away from the window, nudging her pups along with her nose. Once inside, she continued to pace by the window, her eyes darting toward the woods. That night, as the wind howled softly outside, Jack sat by the fire, his rifle resting against the wall nearby. Grace lay at his feet, her body coiled with tension. Snow and Ash snuggled against her, their tiny breaths steady and peaceful. "You're not just being paranoid, are you?" Jack murmured, reaching down to scratch behind her ears. Grace didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the door. Jack stared into the flames, his thoughts racing. Who or what was out there? And why did it feel like they were being watched? The next morning, Jack decided to take Grace and the pups outside. The snow had melted enough to reveal patches of frozen ground, and he thought the fresh air might do them all some good. Grace stepped cautiously onto the porch, her nose twitching as she sniffed the air. Snow and Ash followed close behind, their tiny paws crunching in the snow as they explored. Jack watched them with a smile, leaning on the porch railing. "You're safe now," he said softly. "Nothing's going to hurt you here." But as they ventured a little farther from the cabin, Grace suddenly froze. Her ears shot up and her body tensed as her nose pointed toward the edge of the woods. Jack straightened, his smile fading. "What is it, girl?" Grace let out a deep, guttural growl, her hackles rising. Jack squinted into the trees, his pulse quickening. At first he saw nothing, but then a shadow moved between the trunks. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but enough to make Jack's stomach tighten. Quickly he gathered Snow and Ash into his arms, their tiny bodies wriggling against him. "Come on," he said firmly, guiding Grace back toward the cabin. Once inside, Jack locked the door and pulled the curtain shut. Grace paced by the window, her growls low and constant. "Who's out there?" Jack muttered to himself, his grip tightening on the curtain. That night, as Jack sat by the fire, Grace refused to settle. She stayed by the door, her body rigid and her eyes fixed on the window. Jack reached for his rifle, placing it within easy reach. "Whatever it is, girl, we'll be ready," he said softly. 2 nights later, Jack's unease turned into reality. The moonlight illuminated the snow-covered ground outside, casting long shadows across the yard. Jack sat by the window, his eyes scanning the tree line. Grace lay at his feet, her ears twitching at every sound. Snow and Ash slept soundly by the fire, blissfully unaware of the tension in the air. Then Jack saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the woods. His heart stopped. The figure was tall, cloaked in shadows, and stood unnervingly still. Jack leaned closer to the window, trying to make out more details, but the darkness obscured the stranger's face. "Grace," Jack whispered. Grace bolted upright, her ears perked and her body rigid. The moment she saw the figure, she let out a deep growl, her teeth bared. Jack quickly pulled the curtains shut and grabbed his rifle. His hands trembled slightly as he dialed the local sheriff. "This is Jack Carter," he said, his voice low but firm. "There's someone outside my cabin. They've been standing at the edge of the woods, just watching." The dispatcher assured him a deputy would be sent to check the area, but Jack's grip on the phone tightened. Something about this felt deliberate, too calculated to be a random passerby. Minutes felt like hours as Jack waited. Grace stayed by the door, her growls never ceasing. When the deputy finally arrived, her flashlight cutting through the darkness, Jack exhaled in relief. Deputy Miller, a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes, knocked on the door. Jack quickly explained what he had seen. "It wasn't just a random person," he said. "They were watching us." Miller nodded, her expression serious. "Stay inside. I'll take a look around." She disappeared into the woods, her flashlight bobbing in the distance. Grace pressed herself against the door, her body trembling with tension. When Miller returned, her face was grim. "There's no one out there now," she said, "but I did find tracks leading up to the edge of your property. Whoever it was, they were definitely watching." Jack swallowed hard. "Do you think they'll come back?" Miller hesitated. "I can't say for sure, but if you see anything else, call us immediately." After the deputy left, Jack bolted the door and crouched down beside Grace. "Don't worry, girl," he said softly, stroking her head. "I won't let anything happen to you or the pups." Grace let out a soft whine, her amber eyes meeting his. For the first time, Jack saw something in her gaze he hadn't noticed before, fear mixed with recognition. She knew the person in the woods, and whatever she remembered terrified her. The next morning, Jack woke to the first rays of sunlight seeping through the cracks in the curtains. He hadn't slept much, his mind racing with thoughts of the shadowy figure. Grace remained close to him throughout the night, her body coiled with tension. Snow and Ash slept soundly by the fire, blissfully unaware of the unease in the air. Jack poured himself a cup of coffee, hoping to shake off the lingering exhaustion. As he stood by the window, Grace bolted to the front door, her growl low and guttural. Jack froze, his hand hovering over the coffee pot. He grabbed his rifle and cautiously approached the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer outside. His stomach dropped. The figure was back, standing closer this time, just beyond the edge of the porch. "Damn it," Jack muttered under his breath. The figure stepped forward, revealing a man in his 40s, his face shadowed by the hood of a tattered jacket. In one hand, he carried a rope. In the other, he held a cruel smirk. "That's my dog," the man called out, his voice calm but laced with menace. "I've been looking for her." Jack's blood ran cold. "Your dog?" he asked, his tone sharp. "She showed up at my door half dead with 2 pups. If she's yours, why the hell did she look like that?" The man shrugged, taking another step closer. "She got out. Happens sometimes. But I'm here to take her back." Jack raised his rifle slightly, the barrel pointing squarely at the man's chest. "You're not taking her anywhere. She's not yours anymore." The man's smirk faltered, and he stopped in his tracks. "You don't know what you're dealing with, old man. That dog's trouble. She's better off with me. No, Jack said firmly, his grip on the rifle tightening. She's better off with someone who actually gives a damn. Now get off my property. At that moment, Grace appeared in the doorway. Her body was rigid, her teeth bared in a feral snarl. Grace, get back, Jack ordered, his voice steady but tense. But Grace didn't move. Her eyes were locked on the man, and for the first time, Jack realized just how much she remembered. This wasn't a stranger to her. This was someone she had escaped from. Someone who had hurt her and her pups. The man took a step back, the rope slipping from his hand. You've made a mistake, old man, he said, his voice shaking slightly. You don't know what that dog's capable of. Jack took a step forward, his rifle still raised. The only mistake was you thinking you could come back here and take her. She's not going anywhere, and neither are her pups. Now get off my land before I make you regret it. The man hesitated, his eyes flicking between Jack and Grace. Finally, he turned and retreated into the woods, disappearing among the trees. Jack watched him until he was out of sight. The tension in his shoulders slowly eased, but his mind raced with thoughts of what had just happened. Inside, Jack bolted the door and crouched beside Grace, who was still standing guard. He's gone, he said softly, stroking her head. You did good, girl. Kept us safe. Grace let out a shaky breath, her body finally relaxing as she nuzzled into Jack's hand. Snow and Ash stirred by the fire, their tiny yips breaking the silence. Jack scooped them up and placed them beside Grace, watching as she curled protectively around them. That night, as the fire crackled softly in the hearth, Jack sat with Grace and her pups by his side. He couldn't shake the feeling that the man would come back, and this time he wouldn't come alone. The next morning, Jack got to work. He fortified the cabin, reinforcing the doors and windows with extra wood. He reset the traps around the perimeter, ensuring every blind spot was covered. Years of living in the wilderness had taught him how to defend his home, and he wasn't about to let Grace or her pups be taken away. Grace followed him closely, her amber eyes scanning the woods for any signs of movement. Snow and Ash played near the cabin, oblivious to the tension that hung in the air. You're a tough one, girl, Jack said, glancing at Grace as he secured another trap. And we're going to need that toughness. Grace let out a soft whine, her tail wagging slightly. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jack sat on the porch with Grace by his side. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves replaced by an oppressive stillness. They'll come back, Jack said softly, his gaze fixed on the tree line. But we'll be ready. Grace pressed her head against his knee, her eyes full of trust. The attack came just before dawn. Jack was jolted awake by Grace's growls, low and fierce. Snow and Ash whimpered by the fire, huddling close to their mother. Grabbing his rifle, Jack moved to the window. Through the faint light of the early morning, he saw them. 3 figures emerging from the woods, each one armed and moving with purpose. Jack's jaw tightened. Stay here, he told Grace, though he knew she wouldn't listen. Stepping onto the porch, Jack raised his rifle. That's close enough, he called out, his voice cutting through the cold air. The men stopped, their leader stepping forward. It was the same man from before, his smirk now replaced with a look of cold determination. I told you I'd be back, the man said. Hand over the dog and no one gets hurt. Jack shook his head. Not happening. The leader's smirk returned. You're outnumbered, old man. Think you can take all of us? Jack didn't flinch. You'd be surprised what I can do when someone threatens my family. At that moment, Grace appeared in the doorway, her body rigid and her teeth bared. Snow and Ash peeked out from behind her, their tiny bodies trembling. The leader laughed. Looks like she's ready to fight. But is she ready to win? Jack's grip on the rifle tightened. She doesn't have to. That's my job. The standoff stretched on, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Then, with a sudden burst of movement, one of the men lunged toward the porch. Jack fired a warning shot into the air, the crack of the rifle echoing through the clearing. The man froze, his eyes wide with fear. Grace didn't wait. She charged, her powerful body colliding with the attacker and knocking him to the ground. Chaos erupted. The men scrambled, their confidence shattered by Grace's ferocity and Jack's unwavering aim. Within moments, they retreated, disappearing into the woods. As the clearing fell silent, Jack lowered his rifle and turned to Grace. She stood tall, her sides heaving, but her spirit unbroken. "You did good, girl," Jack said softly, placing a hand on her head. "Real good." The forest slowly returned to its usual rhythm in the days that followed. The men didn't return, their arrogance shattered by the defiance of a man and his dog. Grace had finally found her home, a place where she and her pups could be safe. And Jack had found something he hadn't realized he was missing, a reason to fight, to protect, and to love. As the sun set over the cabin, casting golden light across the clearing, Jack sat with Grace and her pups by the fire. For the first time in years, he felt truly alive. "Welcome home, Grace," he said softly, stroking her fur. And for the first time, Grace let out a soft sigh of contentment, her body completely at ease. Together, they had faced the darkness, and together, they had found the light. Thank you for watching. We hope this incredible story of survival, resilience, and the unbreakable bond between a man and a wild Mustang touched your heart. If it inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories that celebrate courage, hope, and the enduring connection between humans and animals. Let's work together to spread messages of compassion and strength. Stay tuned for more heartfelt tales, and we'll see you in the next video.